Hello, and welcome. Tonight, you will travel back in time to the strange world of the Middle Ages. This is a time when laws were often made because of one unusual or surprising event. These laws might seem funny, odd, or hard to believe now, but they tell us a lot about how people long ago tried to live together with rules and order. This story is told softly, to calm your mind and help you drift peacefully into sleep. So, find a quiet spot, relax your body, and listen to these peaceful tales from long ago. Long ago, in medieval France, something very unusual happened. A pig was put on trial for murder. It sounds strange, but it is true. In a small town called Falaise, a pig attacked a child. Instead of ignoring the pig, or simply killing it, the people decided to hold a real trial. The pig was brought before a court with judges, lawyers, and witnesses. The pig even had a lawyer to speak for it. Imagine that, a pig in a courtroom. The court listened carefully to the case. They said the pig acted with bad intentions. The pig was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging, the same punishment as a person would have received. On the day of the execution, the pig was dressed in human clothes and taken to public gallows. Everyone in the town watched. This strange trial caused a big stir. The church stepped in and made a new law. No animals could be put on trial or executed without permission from the church. This rule showed the importance the medieval people placed on laws, even when the case seemed very strange to us now. Now, let's travel to a different place in Europe called Bohemia. One day, a knight grew bored of the usual jousting tournaments. To make things funny, he brought a goose with him, but not just any goose. This goose was dressed in tiny armor, complete with a helmet. The knight called it his squire and proudly showed the goose to everyone. During the tournament, the goose got scared. It flapped its wings, bit people, and caused a lot of chaos. Horses were frightened, and some knights were hurt. Sadly, the goose died because of the trouble it caused. Because of this event, the local rulers made a law, saying no one could dress up animals as knights or pretend they were part of the battle. It sounds silly today, but back then it was serious. This story shows how one playful idea could cause big problems and even change the law. In medieval England, knights often drank before battles and jousts to calm their nerves. But one knight took too much drink. At a tournament, he was so drunk that instead of hitting his opponent with his lance, he accidentally hit a monk who was praying nearby. The monk was hurt, but luckily he survived. This accident worried the church and town leaders. They decided to make a new law. Knights must not be drunk when fighting in tournaments. This was one of the first rules made to keep people safe during sports, even if the idea of a drunk knight sounds funny to us now. Medieval people had many strange laws. For example, shops had to close at sunset. A bell would ring, and everyone had to put out their fires and lights. This rule was to stop fires from spreading and burning down whole towns made mostly of wood and straw. There was a law about bread and food, too. Bakers were not allowed to make bread that was too fancy or looked like a king's crown. One baker got in trouble for making a round loaf with a ring that looked like a royal crown. People thought it was mocking the king. The baker was fined and had to stand in public with his bread. Even noise had rules. In a small German town, a man named Hansel loved to whistle tunes, but his whistling scared horses and upset neighbors, especially at night. So, the town made a law, banning whistling after dark. These stories show how the Middle Ages were full of strange laws. Often, these laws were made because of one surprising event. Sometimes they seem funny or strange now, but they helped people live safely and peacefully in difficult times. Now, as you listen softly, let your breath slow and your body relax. Soon, you will drift deeper into rest, while these calm stories carry you through the night. The Middle Ages were filled with strange ideas and often stranger laws. Every rule had a reason, usually a very odd one. People followed them because they believed it kept balance in their world. Tonight, as you drift deeper into calm, let's travel through more of these laws, made from chaos, accidents, and mistakes that changed history in the quietest, strangest ways. Once, in medieval Italy, a group of monks discovered music in the wrong place. Inside a monastery, They were supposed to chant slowly and pray quietly. But one night, after long work and too much wine, some monks began to mix hymns with love songs from the tavern nearby. The sound of laughter and tambourines floated through the halls meant for prayer. When the abbot heard it, he was shocked. He ordered silence and wrote a new law. No singing or music after sunset. It was the world's first noise complaint law, and it spread across monasteries everywhere. Centuries later, those same melodies inspired church choirs. A small rule meant to stop music accidentally created more of it. In England, there was once a baker who got too creative. Each baker had to follow the assize of bread, a law about bread's size, price, and weight. But this baker didn't break those rules. He broke style. He baked loaves shaped like crowns, with golden rings of dough. People laughed and called them royal bread. But the wrong person heard about it. A royal officer accused him of mocking the king. The baker was fined and forced to stand in public with his bread tied around his neck. Soon after, Parliament passed a decree. No loaf could look like royal symbols. A single loaf changed how art and baking mixed for centuries. Even bread had to be humble. In another story, a blacksmith in Prague changed history, accidentally and embarrassingly. The summer was scorching, and he decided to work without clothes. In the middle of hammering, a royal carriage passed by. Inside, the queen herself looked out and saw the naked man waving politely with his hammer in hand. By that same evening, the city council gathered. A new law was written. All craftsmen must be dressed appropriately while working. It became the first workplace dress code. Later, cities across Europe copied the rule. The man who started it was forgotten, but his mistake lived forever in law. In France, the story was not about people, but bells. One year, lightning struck a church tower. A massive bronze bell broke loose and rolled through town, smashing stalls and nearly hitting the mayor. The priest declared that the bell had fled its duty. A new law was written. All church bells must be chained to prevent escape. It sounds foolish, but soon the law spread. Bells across France were tied with heavy chains, so they would never run away again. In the hills of England, there was once a nobleman who loved his fish too much. He had a pond full of carp, which he named and fed like children. But after a village party, he found them swimming strangely. He was sure the villagers had poured ale into the pond, making the fish drunk. He was furious and demanded a new rule. The town passed a decree. No one may pour alcohol into a pond with living creatures. It became known as the drunken fish law. Many laughed at it, but it remained written for centuries. As you listen, imagine the warm light of torches fading in stone streets, a soft breeze moving through small windows. These towns were quiet after sunset calm, simple, a little absurd, yet behind each strange law, you can almost hear the laughter of history, the stories whispered by those long gone. There was once a rule about shoes. In medieval France, noblemen wore long, pointed shoes to show wealth. Some shoes were so long they had to be tied to the knees with ribbons, but one duke tripped over his own shoes during a church mass and fell straight into a candlestand. His robe caught fire, and chaos followed. The king ordered a new law. No shoe could extend more than 2 inches beyond the foot. Nobles were furious. Peasants laughed quietly. Fashion had gone too far, and the law had finally caught up to it. In another land, an even stranger thing happened. A rooster was put on trial for witchcraft. A farmer in Switzerland said his rooster had laid an egg, an impossible act. The town believed it was a sign of the devil. The rooster was taken to court. A lawyer spoke in defense. Crowds came to watch. In the end, the poor bird was declared guilty and burned with its evil egg. So a new order was made. No animal could be accused of witchcraft without a priest present to confirm it. That law sounds ridiculous today, but it shows how deeply people feared what they couldn't explain. There was also the tale of shoes that could walk on their own. In Florence, a cobbler named Giovanni made footwear so fine that one nobleman claimed they were haunted. Servants swore they saw the boots walk in the night by themselves. Scared neighbors asked for an investigation. To calm everyone, the city council passed a formal decree. No craftsman shall enchant or curse clothing with unnatural motion. Giovanni's name was cleared, but the law stayed. Even fashion had a ghost of its own. Not every law came from fear. Some came from pride. A priest once challenged a knight to prove that faith was stronger than a sword. They fought at sunrise, one in armor, one in robes. The priest won by sheer luck, humiliated. Church leaders created a new rule. No man of God may ever carry a weapon or fight in a duel. It was meant to prevent more embarrassment. Though some say it also saved lives. Each law began with a wild incident, born of pride, laughter, accidents, or pure foolishness. But what remains most human across them all is the effort, the endless attempt to bring order to a world that refused to be simple. The Middle Ages were full of chaos, but also care, belief, and strange beauty hidden beneath the dust of absurdity. As you take a slow breath, imagine candlelight fading into darkness, the sound of crackling fire in a distant hall. The world outside quiets. The people of that time finish their prayers, close their shutters, and fade into sleep, just as you will soon. Let your mind wander across those narrow cobblestone streets. Let the echo of these ancient tales ease the thoughts of the day until only calm remains. Medieval life was full of strange rules that sometimes seem hard to believe today. One of the most unusual was the belief that animals could be held responsible for crimes. People truly believed animals had souls and could sin, just like humans. This led to what we now call animal trials. Pigs, dogs, and even insects were sometimes arrested, tried in court, and punished. In a famous case in France, a sow was put on trial because it killed a child. The pig had a lawyer, witnesses, and a formal trial. After being found guilty, the pig was dressed in clothes and publicly hanged. This was not a joke, but a serious event. Many similar trials happened throughout Europe, showing how deeply superstition and religion influenced medieval justice. Another curious medieval law involved hunting. Hunting was a privilege only for nobles and royals. Kings claimed all wild animals on their lands. If farmers or peasants were caught hunting without permission, the penalties were harsh: death, fines, or losing a hand. This extreme protection of hunting rights created a divide between the classes and was strictly enforced. Medieval towns also had strict laws about curfews. When the sun went down, a bell would ring, marking the time to put out all fires and lights. This helped prevent devastating fires in towns built mostly with wood. Walking the streets after the curfew was punishable, but noble families and the wealthy were often allowed to ignore this rule, showing how power could bend the law. Then there were the sumptuary laws, which tried to keep people's clothing simple and reflect their social class. Only royalty could wear fur, trimmed with ermine, and only nobles could wear clothes with gold or silver thread. The middle and lower classes had to wear plain clothing. This didn't just control fashion, it kept the social order clear and visible. In a strange twist of fate, some laws tried to control laughter and noise. People in medieval towns were sometimes forbidden to whistle at night. One town in Germany banned all whistling after dark because it disturbed the peace and frightened horses. These simple rules aimed to keep calm and quiet, but they also show how seriously people took daily life. Religion played a huge role in medieval laws. Holy places and people had special protections. For example, clergy could avoid harsh punishments by claiming benefit of clergy, meaning they would be judged by church courts, which were more lenient. This created strange loopholes, where criminals memorized Latin prayers to escape punishment. Witchcraft laws were deadly serious. Women accused of being witches could be tortured and executed. The fear of evil spirits was so strong that entire villages could turn on a neighbor. Witch hunts became common, and laws grew stricter over time. Even marriage had strict rules. Some medieval laws said you needed your master's permission to marry if you were a servant. This was part of the feudal system's control over people's lives. Personal choices were often limited by social and legal rules. Medieval people believed the world was a place of hidden dangers and mysteries. Laws were made to protect, to punish, and sometimes just to explain the Yet, in all this strictness and fear, stories from long ago still bring laughter and wonder. They show us that the past was full of humans trying to make sense, to live safely, and sometimes to survive strangely. Let your breath slow. Feel your body growing heavy. Imagine the soft glow of candlelight flickering in a quiet, medieval room. You are safe. You are calm. The night wraps around you as these ancient stories carry you gently into rest. In medieval times, many rules seem strange, but they all had reasons rooted in the world people knew then. Science was new, and much of life was explained by religion and superstition. When people faced difficult problems, like sickness, bad harvests, or deaths, they often blamed witches. Witches were believed to have powers to call on evil spirits. Sadly, most accused witches were poor women, often elderly and harmless. In 1542, England passed a witchcraft law making witchcraft a crime punishable by death. Witch hunts grew fierce, and many innocent lives were lost. This fear of witches created laws and punishments that today seem cruel and unfair. Another strange medieval law was about football. The football back then was not the gentle game, it was violent, with players fighting and kicking an inflated pig's bladder through villages, sometimes miles apart. Many people were hurt, and games even caused deaths. Because of this, King Edward III banned football in 1349. He wanted strong men ready to fight in wars, not hurt in games. If you played football, you could be jailed for 6 days. There were also strict rules about hunting. Only nobles and kings could hunt animals on their lands. Villagers caught hunting deer or rabbits could be severely punished, sometimes even killed. These forest laws were meant to protect the king's property, keeping peasants away from game. Hunting was a sign of power and class. Medieval towns had curfews. As the sun went down, a bell rang, and all fires or lights had to be put out. This helped prevent fires, because most buildings were wooden. Streets were quiet and empty by curfew. Those who broke this law faced fines, or worse. Rich nobles were often allowed to ignore the rule, showing how laws sometimes favored the powerful. Benefit to clergy was a strange legal trick. If someone accused of a crime could prove connection to the church, they could escape harsh punishment. Simply reading or pretending to know Latin could allow criminals to avoid death or prison. This created a two-track justice system, one for common people and one for those connected to the church. The trick was so common that some criminals memorized prayers to save themselves. Bread was also controlled by law. Bakers had to follow strict rules about the size and price of bread. Making bread to fancy or shaped like a crown was forbidden. One baker was punished for making royal bread that mocked the king. So laws controlled even what people ate and how it looked. Animals even had strange laws. They could be put on trial for crimes like theft or murder. Pigs, roosters, and cows were tried with lawyers and judges. One famous case was a pig hanged for killing a child. Another was a rooster burned for witchcraft because it laid an agone impossible act. In towns, noise was controlled to whistling at night was banned in some places because it disturbed neighbors and frightened horses. These rules kept peace, but show how very different medieval life was. Through all these laws and stories, we see a world that was often harsh, but full of belief, hope, and sometimes humor. Now, as you breathe slow and calm, imagine soft flickering lamps and quiet village streets. Let these memories carry you gently into deep rest. In the quiet shadows of medieval towns and castles, law and order were often kept through fear and strange justice. Pain was a language people understood well. Punishments were harsh and public, meant to stop others from breaking the rules. One of the most feared forms of punishment was torture. Medieval courts used devices like the rack, a large wooden frame that stretched the body, slowly pulling limbs apart. Victims screamed as joints were torn and muscles strained. There was the Iron Maiden, a metal coffin lined with spikes just sharp enough to pierce flesh but not kill instantly. People were branded with hot irons, whipped, or had fingers cut off. These punishments seem cruel now, but at the time, they were seen as necessary to keep peace. Confessions were often extracted through pain. Judges believed that truth came from suffering and that punishment purified the soul as well as the body. The medieval Inquisition was one of the darkest chapters. Those accused of heresy-holding beliefs against the church were tortured and burned at the stake. The public executions were warnings to all. People lived in fear of being accused for thought or speech. The church and kings ruled not just by law, but by terror. Outside courts, simple townspeople followed many daily rules to survive. They had curfews, forbidden to be outside after night. Lights and fires were extinguished early to prevent massive fires that could destroy entire towns made of wood and straw. Some Suari laws dictated what people could wear. Only the richest could show off with furs and jewels. The rest wore plain cloth. This visible distinction kept social order. Clear a man's clothes set his place in the world. Marriage was also carefully controlled. Servants needed their master's permission to wed. Love was often less important than alliance and social standing. Breaking these rules could bring punishments or ruin. Animals had strange roles too. They could be accused of crimes like stealing or biting. Courts held trials of animals, complete with lawyers and judges. One famous pig was dressed in clothes and hanged after being found guilty of killing a child. Roosters were sometimes accused of witchcraft and punished. Many laws were based on superstition. Witches were blamed for bad luck, sickness, or failed crops. Women with healing knowledge or different habits were feared and sometimes killed. Witch hunts were grim and widespread, fueled by laws punishing witchcraft with death. Yet even in this dark world, life continued with laughter and simple joy. People sang songs quietly, told stories by firelight, and dreamed of better days. As you listen now, breathe deeply and slowly. Picture the medieval night, silent and dark, with stars above and soft winds through ancient trees. Let these stories of another time soothe your mind, relax your body, and guide you gently into peaceful sleep. In medieval Europe, law was not just a list of rules or punishments, it was a living force, a woven fabric that held together kingdoms, faith, and the fragile order of society. It moved slowly, shaped by power, by church, and by the customs whispered from one generation to the next. Unlike the printed laws of today, medieval justice was rarely written down. It was remembered in stories, told beside the hearth, in the judgments of elders, in the solemn oaths sworn before God. It was a world where justice had many faces: the stern face of a king, the pious face of a priest, and the weathered face of a village elder. At its heart lay a simple belief: order must be kept. For without order, the fragile world of man would collapse into chaos. Kings ruled by divine right, claiming their crowns were set upon their heads by the will of God himself. To disobey the king's law was not only to challenge his power, it was to sin against heaven. And so, law and religion walked hand in hand, their authority bound by sacred belief. Before royal courts rose to power, justice lived close to home. Each region had its own customs and written, ancient and deeply local. In small villages, people gathered beneath oak trees or inside smoky halls to settle disputes. Elders and lords would listen, weigh the matter, and declare what was fair or what was feared. Punishments might be a fine of silver coins, a few weeks of exile, or a public act of shame. Every judgment was a reminder. In a world without printed law, memory was justice. These customs varied across Europe. The Anglo-Saxons had their dooms and wargals, where even a life could be measured in coin. The Franks and Lombards had their own codes, blending ancient tribal rules with Christian teachings. And over it all, the Church spread its influence, preaching that sin and crime were never far apart. One of the most haunting features of medieval justice was the trial by ordeal, test not of evidence, but of faith. It was believed that God himself would show the truth through pain and survival. A man accused of theft might carry a piece of red-hot iron across his palms. A woman accused of witchcraft might be bound and cast into a river. If the water rejected her, if she floated, she was guilty. For the pure element could not accept the unclean. If she sank, she was innocent, though often beyond saving. Such trials were terrifying, yet many saw them as holy, as divine justice that no human judge could question. Imagine the silence of a village square. The crowd gathered, the priest's voice chanting a prayer as the accused stepped forward. The belief was absolute. God would decide. While local customs governed everyday disputes, the Church built its own powerful legal world. This was canon law, the law of the soul. It ruled over marriage, sin, heresy, and morality, things too sacred for kings to touch. Church courts judged not only priests and monks, but also ordinary people accused of sins like adultery, blasphemy, or sorcery. To be summoned before a bishop's court was to stand before spiritual authority itself. The church's punishments were not always of the body, they were of the spirit. Excommunication meant being cut off from the community of God, denied the sacraments, denied salvation. For many, this was a fate worse than death. In such ways, the church's invisible power often reached further than the king's sword. In the 11th century, something remarkable happened. Old Roman law lost for centuries was rediscovered in dusty manuscripts. Scholars in places like Bologna began to study it, copying and interpreting the ancient words of empire. From this rediscovery, a new intellectual world of law began to grow. Universities taught not only theology, but also jurisprudence. Men trained in logic and Latin became professional jurists, crafting laws with pen and parchment rather than sword and seal. Roman law's precision and order spread across southern Europe, influencing courts and kings alike. Meanwhile, in England, a different path was forming, something that would echo through centuries to come. Under King Henry II, in the 12th century, a new system emerged: common law. It sought to unify the patchwork of customs across the realm into one consistent royal justice. Judges, appointed by the crown, traveled from shire to shire, hearing disputes and recording their rulings. Each decision became a precedenta guide for the next case. Thus, the law began to grow like a living tree, each branch built on those before it. Trials by jury replaced trials by ordeal, and reason slowly began to challenge superstition. The king's writs, the royal orders, became instruments of power and centralization. Sheriffs, bailiffs, and constables enforced these laws, collecting taxes, seizing lands, and ensuring loyalty to the crown. But even as royal justice grew stronger, so too did resistance. Feudal lords clung to their privileges, and the church fought to protect its independence. Power and law were intertwined, each reshaping the other in a constant struggle between throne and altar. Yet justice was not equal for all. The noble might escape with a fine, the peasant might face the gallows. Bribery, torture, and corruption were never far from the courtroom. Confessions were often forced, and silence could be mistaken for guilt. Still, amid the cruelty, the idea of justice was a Valvenger, fragile hope that law might one day serve fairness rather than fear. Medieval law covered every corner of life: the ownership of land, the inheritance of titles, the sanctity of marriage, and the punishments for theft or rebellion. It reflected the strict social hierarchy: one law for the nobles, another for the serfs. Even so, it laid the groundwork for modern systems of governance, rights, and courts that still echo through today's world. Punishments were often public, meant to warn as much as to wound. The guilty might stand in the stocks for days, mocked by their neighbors. Thieves could lose a hand, traitors their heads. But not all sentences were cruel. Some were symbolic, such as fasting, pilgrimage, or public apology. Every act of judgment carried both terror and ritual, binding communities together through shared understanding of guilt and redemption. And so, as centuries passed, the slow rhythm of law continued, an uneasy balance between tradition and change. The church, the crown, and the people all claimed a piece of justice. What began as ancient custom grew into something larger, a foundation for nations, for governance, for civilization itself. Close your eyes and imagine the echoing footsteps of judges in a stone hall, the flickering light of candles on parchment scrolls, the murmurs of townsfolk awaiting a verdict that could change a life. The calm, solemn voice of the clerk reading the charge. Feel the stillness as the court awaits its judgment. In that silence, across centuries, you can almost sense the birth of order, the long, slow creation of the laws that still guide us today. And as the night deepens, let the distant murmur of medieval courts fade into quiet dreams of kingdoms long gone, of justice both cruel and kind, and of a world learning, one step at a time, how to live by law. In medieval England, the idea of police forces, as we know them today, did not exist. Instead, communities policed themselves using a system called tithings. A tithing was a group of about 10 men who were responsible for each other's behavior. If a member of a tithing committed a crime or misbehaved, the others had to bring him to justice or face penalties themselves. The head of each tithing was called the chief pledge. This man, often the wealthiest in the group, represented the tithing in local courts and had to make sure the group behaved properly. To catch criminals, people raised the hue and cry a loud call for help. Anyone hearing this was expected to join the chase to catch the wrongdoer. Constables, appointed from among the respectable villagers, helped keep order. Although unpaid and part-time, constables coordinated the hue and cry and reported crimes. One constable's job was to lead their tithing in bringing lawbreakers to the local court. Above the constables were bailiffs, officials responsible for justice in their district called a hundred. Hundreds were subdivisions of counties, and the bailiff managed local law enforcement and collected fines. They ensured order and represented the king's authority in the region. Sheriffs were powerful royal officers appointed by the king, overseeing entire counties. They had many duties collecting taxes, organizing militias, executing court orders, and even holding trials. Sheriffs could summon the posse, an armed group of local men ready to pursue criminals or defend against threats. Cities and towns had their own law enforcement known as the Night Watch. Watchmen patrolled the streets, especially after curfew, to deter crime and keep the peace. Paid. These watchmen were often poorly trained, undisciplined, and sometimes corrupt. Stories tell of watchmen sleeping or extorting money, but their presence still maintained some public order. Justice was a patchwork of community responsibility and royal authority. Trials often involved local juries and evidence through witnesses or oaths. Punishments varied widely, from fines and public shaming to harsh penalties like mutilation or death. Despite the challenges and cruelty, this system laid the foundation for modern policing and justice. Over time, central authority grew stronger, and the idea of state-controlled law enforcement developed. As you listen to the distant echoes of medieval life, the clatter of wooden shoes, the crackle of fires, the quiet murmur of courts, let your mind grow calm and peaceful. Feel the slow pulse of history, drawing you softly toward rest. In the world of medieval justice, few things stirred more awe or fear than the trial by combat. It was not just a fight. It was a sacred test, a battle of truth, witnessed not only by men, but by God. When all words failed, when no witness could speak, when doubt shadowed the truth, the sword became the final voice of judgment. It was believed that in combat, God would reveal the innocent, guiding the hand of the rightful victor. Victory meant divine favor. Defeat, divine condemnation. The roots of this ritual reached far back to the ancient Germanic tribes, long before the rise of kings and cathedrals. These early peoples believed deeply in faith. The gods of the old world guided strength, courage, and justice. When their customs merged with Christian Europe, the duel transformed. No longer a pagan test of valor, but a Christian appeal to divine will. By the Middle Ages, the practice had spread across much of Europe. Kings and nobles alike used it to settle grave disputes over land, inheritance, betrayal, and honor. In a time when written evidence was scarce and trust was fragile, a duel offered something that words could not: a visible, decisive end. Picture the scene. A cold morning mist clings to the earth. Two men stand within a fenced arena, surrounded by solemn witnesses. A priest blesses them both, declaring that God will judge between them this day. One man kneels, touching the ground, whispering a final prayer. The other tightens his grip on his sword, heart pounding beneath layers of steel and fear. Around them, the crowd falls silent: peasants, nobles, clergy, all watching, waiting. Then the horn sounds. Steel clashes. The air fills with the echo of armor, the sharp rhythm of breath, the dull thud of boots in the mud. Each strike is both physical and spiritual, each wound a possible message from heaven. For the victor, there is glory, vindication, and survival. For the defeated, shame and often death. But even death was accepted, for to lose was to be judged by God himself. Not all who fought were strong warriors. Sometimes the elderly, the sick, or women could choose a chempona knight or mercenary who fought on their behalf. The champion's courage became their voice, and their sword carried the weight of another's honor. To fight for someone else was to bear both burden and blessing. For if the champion lost, both he and the one he defended could suffer the same fate. Among the many duels recorded in history, one stands apart in its drama and consequence. The trial by combat of 1386 in France. A nobleman named Jean de Carouche accused his former friend Jacques Legris of a terrible crime, the assault of Jean's wife, Marguerite. In a world where a woman's testimony was often dismissed, Marguerite's voice carried little power in the courts. But Jean's fury and faith would not rest. He demanded a trial by combat, declaring that God would reveal the truth through blood and steel. King Charles VI himself granted permission, and the duel was arranged in a grand Parisian arena before nobles, clergy, and a breathless crowd. When the day came, the two knights met face to face, once friends. Now bound by hate and fate, they fought with brutal determination, their swords shattering shields, their armor dented and torn. At last, Jean de Carouge struck down Jacques Legris, and the crowd erupted. To all present, it was not Jean's skill that won the day, it was God's judgment. Legris was declared guilty, and justice was believed to have been done. Marguerite was vindicated, and Jean became a symbol of righteous vengeance. His duel remembered for centuries as the last judicial combat sanctioned by the French crown. Yet even as the world admired such acts of divine judgment, a quiet unease began to grow. Many questioned whether truth truly lived in the strength of a sword arm. What of the weak, the poor, or the innocent who could not fight? What of those who prayed just as deeply, yet fell in battle? Slowly, reason began to replace ritual. Scholars and kings sought better ways to find justice, ways that relied on evidence, witnesses, and written law, rather than combat and chance. But before these changes came, another practice still held the people in AOI. The trial by ordeal. Where trial by combat tested strength and courage, the ordeal tested faith and purity of spirit. The accused might be made to carry a red-hot iron across their bare hands, or plunge their arm into boiling water. After several days, priests examined the wounds. If they healed cleanly, it was a sign of innocence. If they festered, guilt had been revealed. In another form, the ordeal by water, the accused was tied and lowered into a pond or river. The belief was simple, though cruel. Holy water would reject the guilty, and they would float upon its surface. The innocent, pure of art, would zinka, tragic mercy, for many drowned before they could be pulled free. To modern minds, such rituals seem harsh, even senseless. But to the people of the Middle Ages, they were sacred. They truly believed that God's hand guided the outcome, that no injustice could survive divine scrutiny. Fear and faith mingled in equal measure. Each trial, a moment where heaven itself seemed to watch. Both trial by combat and trial by ordeal reveal the same truth about the medieval world. That law was not only a matter of man, but of God and destiny. Justice was not blind, it was divine, unpredictable, and often terrifying. People placed their fate in higher hands, believing that even pain and death served a greater truth. And though centuries have passed, these stories remind us how far we have come from a time when faith was the evidence and the battlefield was a courtroom. Now, as you rest and listen, imagine the hush before a duel, the air heavy with tension and prayer. Imagine the sunlight glinting on steel, the crowd holding its breath, believing that the next strike could reveal heaven's will. Then let it all fade. Let the echoes of swords soften into silence. Let the fires of the ordeal cool to embers. The judgments are done, the crowds dispersed, the fields empty beneath a quiet sky. The age of divine justice has passed, and in its place stands the long, slow dawn of reason and peace. As you drift into sleep, let the ancient world fall away behind you and feel the calm of centuries settling into stillness. The duel is over. The verdict is peace. The night is yours. Medieval justice was harsh, and one of the darkest aspects was the use of torture, not only to punish, but often to force confessions. Though fearsome, these methods were a part of the complex system of law and order, believed necessary in a world where proving truth was difficult and power was absolute. One infamous device was the rack. It was a wooden frame with rollers at each end. The victim's hands and feet were tied, and the rollers turned to stretch the body painfully. As the body was pulled in opposite directions, joints dislocated, muscles tore, and unbearable pain followed. Victims screamed, sometimes begging to confess, hoping pain would end quickly. Another cruel device was the Judas cradle. This torture tool was shaped like a pyramid. The victim was lowered onto its sharp points slowly. The pain of being impaled but not killed created a cruel uncertainty, dragging out suffering. This device appeared in many European prisons, especially during the Inquisition. The pear of anguish was a small metal device, shaped like a pear with leaves that opened inside a body orifice. Screws expanded the leaves, tearing flesh painfully. The pear was sometimes used in the mouth, rectum, or vagina, causing terrible agony meant to force words or punish heretics. Though often thought to be medieval, the Iron Medina spiked iron coffin may be more legend than fact. First referenced centuries later, the idea of a slow death surrounded by spikes captured the era's fearsome imagination and still chills the mind today. The thumbscrew was a smaller but effective device. It crushed fingers or thumbs between two metal plates tightened by a screw. The sharp pain could cause someone to confess or beg for mercy. Despite its simplicity, it was widely used to punish minor offenses or obtain information. Other tortures included the heretic's fork, a two-pronged fork held under the chin and on the chest by a strap, preventing the victim from moving or sleeping without pain. The fear of madness pushed accused heretics to confess. Medieval dungeons echoed with cries and racked bodies behind stone walls. Yet history also shows that torture was controversial. Some judges saw it as cruel and avoided its use when possible. It was feared but a tool of law to enforce strict control. As Jules Listet imagined the flicker of torchlight casting long shadows on cold stone. Breathe slowly and deeply. These grim tales remind us of human cruelty, but also of the harsh realities faced by those in the past. Let calm wash over you and guide you to gentle, peaceful sleep. The Middle Ages were a time of harsh justice, where punishment was often brutal and designed to instill fear. Among the cruelest tools were various torture devices, each designed to cause pain, humiliation, and confessions. One of the most infamous was the rack. It was a wooden frame where victims had their wrists and ankles tied. A crank was turned that stretched the body painfully, dislocating joints and tearing muscles. It caused unbearable agony meant to force confessions. This device was known as the Duke of Exeter's daughter in England, named after the noble responsible for its introduction. Another terrifying device was the Judas cradle. It was shaped like a pyramid, and victims were slowly lowered onto its sharp tip, painfully impaling the pelvis over time. This horror created excruciating suffering, and was used mostly during the Spanish Inquisition. The pear of anguish was a metal device shaped like a pear, inserted into mouths or other parts of the body. Once inside, metal leaves opened slowly, causing severe internal pain without immediate death. While painful, it was one among many devices meant to break victims' spirits. Though often thought to be medieval, the Iron Maiden or spiked iron coffin likely appeared later. Victims were enclosed inside with spikes designed to pierce but not kill immediately, prolonging suffering until death. This device remains a chilling symbol of medieval cruelty. Smaller tools like the thumbscrew crushed fingers or thumbs between metal plates tightened by a screw. While less deadly, it caused sharp pain to punish or extract confessions. The heretic's fork, used by the Spanish Inquisition, was a two-pronged fork held under the chin and against the chest by a strap, preventing sleep or speech due to continuous pain. This torment pushed victims toward madness and confession. Other abuses included branding with hot irons, whipping, and amputation. Public executions were spectacles, serving as warnings to others. Despite its infamy, torture was not always widespread. Some records showed judges used it reluctantly, fearing its cruelty. Still, the threat of these devices haunted many accused during the Middle Ages. As you listen, feel the flicker of torchlight casting long shadows on cold dungeon walls. Breathe slowly and deeply. These tales remind us of human cruelty in history, but also of the endurance of the human spirit. Let calm wash over you as you drift to restful sleep. In the long shadow of medieval justice, the instruments of torture were as varied as they were terrifying. These devices were designed not only to punish, but often to coerce confessions, instill fear, and demonstrate the power of rulers and the church. One of the most infamous devices was the rack. Introduced in England by the Duke of Exeter, victims were stretched on a wooden frame with their hands and feet tied to rollers. As the rollers were turned, the body was pulled apart, dislocating joints and tearing ligaments. The endless agony led many to confess anything to escape the pain. Another dreadful device was the Judas cradle, a pyramid-shaped seat with a sharp point. Victims were slowly lowered onto it, impaling the body painfully over time. The cruel design made escape impossible, and the slow torture was feared across Europe, especially during the Spanish Inquisition. The pear of anguish was a small metal device, shaped like a pear with leaves that opened wide inside the mouth or other body orifices. Turning a screw expanded the leaves, causing excruciating internal damage. Though some debate its true medieval use, it remains a chilling example of torture aimed at extracting truth or punishing. The brazen bull, originating in ancient Greece, was a hollow metal bull where victims were placed inside and roasted alive over a fire. The bull was designed with pipes to mimic a bellowing bull's roar, turning the victim's screams into terrifying sounds. While not widely used in medieval Europe, the story reminded people of cruelty and power. Smaller devices like the thumbscrew crushed fingers with metal plates tightened by screws, causing sharp pain to force confession. The Iron Maiden, a sarcophagus lined with spikes, may belong more to legend, with earliest references arising centuries after the medieval period, yet it symbolizes medieval cruelty. The heretic's fork had two-pronged forks held under the chin and against the chest by a leather strap, preventing victims from speaking or sleeping. The constant pain pushed many to madness, aimed at breaking heretics during inquisitions. Other tortures included branding, whipping, amputation, and public humiliation, all intended to deter crime and enforce harsh laws. Public executions were common, serving as grim warnings to others. Despite the horror, torture was often seen as a last resort, and some medieval judges preferred to avoid its use when possible. Yet the threat and reality of these devices haunted many accused of crimes or heresies within stone-walled dungeons. As you listen now, feel the flickering torchlight, the cold stone, and the quiet whispers of the past. Breathe slowly and deeply. The gruesome tales of medieval torture remind us of human cruelty, but also of resilience through the ages. Let these calm words ease your mind as you fall into gentle and peaceful sleep. During the medieval period, a vast array of brutal torture methods was developed and used to punish and extract confessions from accused criminals or heretics. These daggers of human cruelty and ingenuity reflected the grim reality of medieval justice. Though difficult to hear about, understanding these devices gives us insight into a time of harsh law and order. One horrid instrument was the cranium crusher. This metal device featured a plate below the victim's jaw, connected to a head cap above by a frame. Slowly twisting a handle tightened to the gap, crushing teeth, jawbones, and facial bones until the skull cracked. Variants included small containers held in front of the eyes, so they would fall out as the skull broke. This gruesome device was used primarily during the Spanish Inquisition, leaving victims either dead or disfigured beyond recognition. Another fearsome device was the scavenger's daughter, the opposite of the rack. Instead of stretching the victim, it compressed the body into a painful kneeling position. Lungs quickly filled with blood due to the forced posture, causing agony and near suffocation. Some versions also grasped the neck and ankles tightly. This device was especially brutal, known for causing prolonged suffering. The pit of despair was a form of solitary confinement, often a deep, narrow hole where victims were trapped in isolation with little room to move or stand. Though originally used as a trap for intruders, the pit became a method for imprisoning and breaking people psychologically. The darkness, loneliness, and cramped space could drive victims to madness long before any physical harm. The manacles were simple iron gauntlets placed on prisoners' wrists and suspended from an iron bar. leaving them hanging by their hands or arms for hours or days. This caused immense pain, swelling, and sometimes permanent nerve damage. Jesuit priest John Gerard, imprisoned in the Tower of London, described his ordeal on manacles, where he was left hanging without relief. The thumbscrew, originating from Russia before becoming popular in Europe. Crushed thumbs or fingers between metal plates, tightened by screws. Some screws included sharp spikes to pierce flesh. Though it rarely killed, the thumbscrew's pain was unbearable and effective in forcing confessions or punishing minor crimes. The Iron Maiden, despite its reputation, likely did not exist in medieval times, but became a symbol of torture later. It was said to be a hollow iron coffin lined with spikes designed not to kill instantly, but to prolong agony as the victim slowly bled out over hours. This legendary device reflected the imagination of medieval cruelty. Other brutal punishments included the tongue terror, which was like heated gardening shears clamped on the tongue and torn out, silencing blasphemers or heretics. The breaking wheel, where criminals were tied and beaten, with limbs broken or impaled on spikes and left as warnings, and numerous forms of public humiliation and mutilation. Each device, though horrific, was part of a justice system aimed at controlling society through fear and obedience. Judicial torture was a painful reminder of the power of church and state, forcing compliance through terror. As you listen quietly now, picture the flickering lights of a medieval dungeon, the cold stone walls, and hear distant echoes of history's harsh lessons. Breathe deeply and slowly, letting these ancient tales soothe your mind and guide you gently toward peaceful sleep. In the somber chambers of medieval castles and prisons, a terrifying arsenal of torture devices awaited those accused of crimes or heresy. These instruments were crafted not only to inflict pain, but to serve as chilling reminders of the power rulers held over life and death. One device, known as the Judas cradle, was as cruel as it sounds. Shaped like a pyramid or triangular seat, the victim was suspended and slowly lowered onto the pointed tip. The device targeted the most sensitive parts of the body, causing agonizing pain through weight and gravity. This invention was widely used during the Spanish Inquisition to extract confessions through unbearable suffering. The rack, legendary in its cruelty, stretched victims to the breaking point. Bound by wrists and ankles, the victim's body was pulled apart until joints dislocated and muscles tore. This relentless torment forced many to admit to crimes they never committed, revealing the stark reality of medieval justice, a system caught between law and terror. The pear of anguish, a small handheld contraption shaped like a pear with expanding metal leaves, was inserted into orifices such as the mouth or rectum. Turning a screw caused the leaves to expand, tearing internal tissues in excruciating pain, often preceding further punishment or execution. The head crushers slowly suffocated and crushed the skull with tightening iron plates. Pain was immense, and death inevitable. This device left victims broken and shamed, a grim spectacle to deter others from defiance. Though often linked with medieval cruelty, the Iron Maiden, a spiked iron coffin, likely originated later, but symbolizes the fear and brutality of the era. The enclosed spikes were arranged to pierce vital organs slowly, allowing prolonged agony before death. Other devices included the scavenger's daughter, which compressed the body painfully, and the Spanish donkey, a sharp wooden beam forcing victims to straddle it while weights increased suffering. The breast ripper, specifically used against women accused of adultery or witchcraft, tore flesh mercilessly. The heretic's fork confined victims' chins and chests with sharp prongs, preventing movement, speech, and sleep, driving many to madness during interrogations. Medieval torture chambers echoed with the cries of victims, yet history shows some reluctance in its use by judges wary of cruelty. Regardless, the instruments stood as stark warnings of the consequences of defying authority. As the flicker of torchlight dances upon ancient stone, let your mind drift calmly through the silent halls of history's darkest moments. Breathe gently and allow the weight of centuries to carry you toward deep and peaceful sleep. Throughout the long and often dark history of medieval justice, the instruments of torture serve as grim reminders of the harsh realities faced by those who lived under the fear of law and power. From dislocating joints on the rack to the terrifying slow agony of the Judas cradle, each device tells a story of pain mingled with a hope for truth or mercy. The Iron Maiden, the pair of anguish, head cruisers, and thumbscrews, all cruel in design, formed a shadowy toolkit for control and punishment. Though horrifying, these devices have helped historians understand the depths of human fear, endurance, and the evolution of justice. But history also tells of the resilience of people, the growth of ideas that led to modern legal systems respecting rights and fairness. The past is a place full of lessons. As your mind settles, imagine the flickering candle, the soft rustle of pages turning in an ancient tome, and the gentle silence of a world long past. Let these whispered tales carry you toward restful sleep, as history's long night embraces you with peace. If you enjoyed this journey through medieval laws and mysteries, please subscribe for more calming stories that soothe the mind and spirit. Share your thoughts and favorite stories in the comments. Sweet dreams, and thank you for listening. Isko jitna expen kar sakte ho utna, karo isko expen karo. Throughout the long and often dark history of medieval justice, the instruments of torture serve as grim reminders of the harsh realities faced by those who lived under the fear of law and power. From dislocating joints on the rack to the terrifying slow agony of the Judas cradle, each device tells a story of pain mingled with the hope for truth or mercy. The rack was one of the most infamous devices introduced to England in the 15th century by the Duke of Exeter. Victims were laid on a wooden frame and their wrists and ankles tied to ropes connected to rollers. As the rollers were turned, the body was stretched painfully, sometimes dislocating the joints and snapping ligaments. The relentless tension caused unbearable agony, forcing many to confess whatever their torturers demanded to escape the torment. Despite its cruelty, it was used sparingly and considered a last resort. The Judas cradle, also known as the Judas chair, was a pyramid-shaped device that inflicted slow and excruciating pain. Victims were slowly lowered onto the pointed tip, which penetrated and stretched sensitive areas of the body. Though this device varied in design, it was most commonly associated with the Spanish Inquisition and was feared for the lasting agony it caused. Another device, the pair of anguish, was a metal instrument shaped like a pear with expandable leaves. It was inserted into the mouth or other orifices, and as a screw was tightened, the leaves expanded, tearing internal flesh with excruciating pain. Though often attributed to medieval times, its actual use remains debated. But it symbolizes the horrific ways people were punished. The Iron Maiden is perhaps the most famous torture device, but historians agree it was likely a 19th century invention rather than a medieval tool. Described as an iron coffin lined with spikes, it was said to impale victims slowly, prolonging suffering over hours. Despite lacking real medieval origins, the Iron Maiden has become a powerful symbol of the era's cruelty. Other torture devices included the thumbscrew, which crushed thumbs or fingers in a vise, sometimes with spikes, to increase pain, and the head crusher, which slowly crushed the skull using tightening iron plates. The heretic's fork, used during the Spanish Inquisition, prevented victims from speaking or sleeping by holding two forks under the chin and against the breastbone, driving the victim toward insanity. Medieval dungeons echoed with the sounds of suffering, and punishment was often a public spectacle designed to deter others through fear. Branding, whipping, mutilation, and execution were common, and the law was enforced harshly. Yet, despite these brutal methods, medieval torture was not as widespread as legend suggests. It was usually reserved for serious cases like heresy or treason, and governed by strict rules. History also shows the resilience of people and the gradual development of justice systems that respect rights and fairness. Over time, ideas of torture and punishment changed, moving toward more humane methods and legal protections. As your mind settles, imagine the flickering candle, the soft rustle of pages turning in an ancient tome, and the gentle silence of a world long past. Let these whispered tales carry you toward restful sleep, as history's long night embraces you with peace. If you enjoyed this journey through medieval laws and mysteries, please subscribe for more calming stories that soothe the mind and spirit. Share your thoughts and favorite stories in the comments. Sweet dreams, and thank you for listening.